Okay, welcome to a meeting of the subcommittee of the Seneca County IDA. This is the Solar Project Subcommittee. This is a subcommittee that we have recently formed to do a deeper analysis of the subject of solar projects in Seneca County and the IDA's posture towards them. Since this is the very first meeting, I suspect what we'll be doing is all kind of getting up to speed and on the same page with respect to the facts. I don't think there will be any decisions made today, but what I'd like to do is at least in the next hour or so kind of frame the issues that we should be focusing on. I think we need to review what our policies have been. We need to ask, should we make any changes to those policies? And if so, what kinds of changes we ought to make? It's point one. Point two, this meeting was prompted in part by a letter I received from Supervisor Partee, who's here in the audience. Supervisor Partee sent a memo suggesting that there are several different ways to approach solar projects. Other counties around the state have taken various different approaches, and I think because Supervisor Partee is the chair of the county's finance committee, and because tax abatements, such as they may be, ultimately influences the county's finances, I think it's important that we take a look at this, particularly because of her request. So we have an agenda in front of us. Before we start going down the agenda, are there any comments or thoughts before we begin? All right, so Sarah and I put this together, and I'm gonna turn it over principally to you to give us, and I'd like this to be a discussion and not a lecture.
Okay.
All right?
I'll see what I can do.
All right.
Please feel free to jump in with questions.
All right.
Okay, so we thought it would be helpful to start out for everybody just talking a little bit about the history of a specific provision of real property tax law, which is section 487. And the reason being is that is really what incentivizes not just solar, but other types of renewable energy in New York State. And it is one of the driving forces for these developers coming and seeking pilots. Okay, so just this morning we put together a brief history of this provision. It actually was originally enacted in 1977 in New York State because of the energy crisis happening in the 70s, fuel shortages, oil embargoes. People were starting to sort of worry. Obviously, what was passed then is not what it looks like now. So it's been reenacted twice since then, most recently in 2014. And so that's more or less the version, although it has had amendments even since it was last reenacted. And some of those amendments are pretty key, I think, to what we're gonna be discussing as a whole today. So, one of them was extending the eligibility for projects. So 487 has been, for as long as I can tell, a time-limited exemption, meaning that projects had to be constructed within a certain time period in order to be eligible for what is essentially a 15-year, 100% exemption on the added value.
So just to put it in slightly different terms, if you want to construct and operate one of these facilities, the state has said you will be subject to no property taxes during the first 15 years. That's a pretty extreme, it's a pretty blanket, broad condition established by the state, which created a pretty wide runway for renewable energy.
But that's no property taxes on the added value.
Correct.
Correct.
But it's still significant, especially when we start looking at what the assessed values would be of these projects and that kind of thing. So the eligibility was extended. As of right now, projects have to be constructed before January 1st, 2030 in order to be eligible for 487. And that was extended rather recently. They've also added, and this is not that relevant for our discussion today, but they have added all kinds of other technology. It's not just solar and wind, so they've added micro hydroelectric, fuel cell electric, combined heat and power generating, and electric energy storage systems. That was done around 2019. One piece that'll be key to our discussion a little bit later on is there was an amendment in 2021 regarding the way solar is assessed. So it's different than most every other form of property. The state puts together a discounted cash flow model. State Department of Taxation and Finance, in concert with NYSERDA, they publish that model every year, and the assessors are meant to use that to value solar as opposed to sort of doing it on their own.
And again, as I've wrestled with this myself, it seems as if you boil it all down to a kind of the final sort of issue, it's how should it be taxed? This is a project, this is an improvement. What is the methodology for establishing what the proper tax rate is? And that's a pretty arcane art, I think, which is to say, you built this is what you will be owing. I think there are a lot of different ways to do it, and that's kind of where we've ended up.
Yeah, but it's clear that the underlying motivation for getting into all this is to encourage this sector's growth.
Yes.
Because without it, it didn't seem to be moving very rapidly.
Right.
So in one way, it's just looking at it, it's, trying to balance the two things. In one way, 487 is no additional taxes on the increase. And then there's the amendment on how, so I guess if a taxing jurisdiction, municipality, whatever, is opting out, and, well, we'll get into this more, and there's either no taxes, or if you're going to assign taxes, is this a recommended, or is this a thou shalt?
A mandatory.
Mandatory assessment
So-
model.
So why don't we discuss this opting out issue, because it makes sense. If you think of it logically, the state of New York says to municipalities, you can, for the next 15 years, anyone can come into your jurisdiction, develop whatever the projects that meet these criteria, but you may not tax them. The state or the municipalities then said, time out, that's not really fair. And the state said, okay, you can opt out of the requirements of 487. And then the municipality had to step back and say, well, how do we assess these projects? And the state has stepped in and said, well, here's one way to do it, but the municipality is not required to follow those guidelines. And you have to come up with something else if you're not gonna follow those guidelines. And traditionally, and there's not been a long history, if the first one was approved in Seneca, or the IDA's first incentive agreement was 2020, this is all very new for the county. It's not as if we have 50 years of precedent to follow. It's all pretty fresh. And we have followed, to my knowledge, pretty much the state's guidelines along these, so far. And said, in the absence of something different, we'll use the state's guidelines.
Okay. So yeah, so the assessment is more or less set by the state, sort of a plug and play model. There's factors that you've input. It has to do with geographic region and what the utility reimbursement rates are and the incentives that they're getting from the state and all kinds of things. And it gives you a model, and it's supposed to be updated every year. And then the last key to this is that there was a modification recently, within the last couple of years, that a developer is required to notify the local taxing jurisdiction, so that means town, county, school, and village, if it's in a village, that they intend to essentially construct their solar facility or other renewable energy facility and they have to reference the real property tax law 487. And they essentially give that municipality 60 days to respond. And if they've opted out already of 487, they don't have to respond. If they have not opted out of 487, they have 60 days to respond and require a pilot agreement instead. So that's sort of the last piece. And then just as some context, because we talked about, why is the state offering such a generous incentive, really? And it's largely in part because of their renewable energy goals. So their latest renewable energy goals in terms of electric is they want 70% of the state's electricity to come from renewable energy by 2030, being zero emission fully by 2040. Currently, renewable and nuclear, which I believe they do include nuclear as part of their renewable goal, accounts for about 51% of the state's energy supply. So they're still, a fair ways off, which is why they've extended out the 47 eligibility for projects up through 2030 and why they're still trying to heavily incentivize. Because as Bruce said, our first project here with the IDA was in 2020. There was one or two solar projects that happened in Seneca County prior to that, directly through towns. I believe the town of Seneca Falls may have been the only one. And if you look at other counties, they really weren't common in other counties before that time period either. You might have seen, projects starting to come a little bit in 2018, 2019-ish, but that was about the earliest, and then they really kind of took off after that.
So let's try to just summarize the IDA's policy so far, which is we would abide by the state's guidelines as well as by the individual towns' planning boards, so such that if the town has approved this project, again, let me just state what I believe the policy to be, is that as long as a town's planning board, zoning boards approve the project, then the IDA's posture has been to extend the standard New York State recommended incentives for those projects.
Correct, that we would, as an IDA, we're not, I don't know, calling strikes and balls. We're not approving a project, we're not disapproving a project. If the town is approving a solar project, we're there to do the pilot
On its
project on their behalf, or on behalf of the project that's already been approved. That it's not, if the project, well, obviously, if the project is not approved by the local municipality, we're not gonna come and say, no, you can do it anyways. And if it's approved by the local municipality, we're not gonna come in and say, no, you shouldn't have solar. I mean, we're neutral on that part. It's just
And the incentive, the level of the incentive has been relatively consistent based on the type of project that it is. If it's a 5 megawatt project or community solar, smaller scale, the incentive is X, and if it's larger scale or utility scale, the incentive is Y.
For our purposes, it's always been X and X. When we were first developing, so our actual UTEP agreement is where we outlined what the incentives would be that would be offered to solar. Mostly because as soon as you sort of get the board to agree to that and put it in writing, you know, it puts the terms out there, the solar developers are aware of it, and then it allows you to sort of stand your ground when they're trying to negotiate and push for more, because they always try to push for more. The terms which we use, which is $4,500 per megawatt for 15 years with a 2% annual escalator. Now and they also still have to pay the base taxes on the property, so we combine the pilot payment and we bill the whole thing. But it's essentially base tax and then plus the solar piece on top. That was put together with a lot of research and based on the guidance of the state, which had different recommendations based on which territory you were in, based on who the utility providers were, and all of those kinds of things. It was sort of the state's attempt to help provide IDAs with some context and some information based on the different economics across the state. So when we approved that, we were kind of at the top end of what the recommended range was for pilot payments. This is jumping ahead a little bit, but the MRB report that came out in 2021 was then essentially a study within the Genesee Finger Lakes region that we're a part of. All of those IDAs, you know, what are they doing? What is solar looking like? This was a time when we were really, you know, sharing our information. I mean, we still do, but it was really, you know, we were all seeing these projects for the first time, and we're sort of wanting to share best practices and make sure that we were all kind of on the same page. So based on the state's initial guidelines, we had anticipated possibly needing a different, needing a different pilot payment structure for the utility scale versus the community scale, which are the small ones. Because utility scale solar gets reimbursed at a wholesale rate versus community scale, which is retail.
And where, if I may ask Sarah, the need to treat utility scale differently from community scale, where did that realization originate from?
New York State,
New York State, okay.
because of the different economics of the way the projects are reimbursed.
Okay.
So we had anticipated having to do that. So when the UTEP was worded, it was intentionally worded to apply specifically to community scale with the ability for us to negotiate if needed for other projects. However, we ended up opting to not do that. So the first and only utility scale that's come to us so far was the Trelina project in Waterloo. And by the time that came to us, you know, we had been anticipating it, and I had been talking with colleagues and said, hey, what are you guys doing in terms of these bigger projects? And the thought at the time was, well, let's not negotiate against ourselves. Let's offer them the same terms that we are for the other projects and see what they do. And we did, and they took it. I think in large part because for them at the time, the value was really in knowing what the pilot payments were going to be in terms of financing and capital and all of that. And so having a known entity, even if it wasn't a huge savings, was a value. And then we've stuck with that ever since.
Although for utility projects, they typically come with a community host agreement.
So
Yes.
that's over and above what they're paying as a pilot.
Yeah, so essentially from, I guess, the IDA perspective, whether you're, you know, a 5 megawatt or less community solar or a huge utility, typically we would treat those the same for consistency, knowing that with like the Trelina, the community would be negotiating a community host agreement for additional taxes and additional benefits.
Mhm.
So essentially, we have, through the IDA, a baseline
Mhm.
pilot regardless of the size.
Mhm.
And then utilities, it's, I don't wanna say it's up to the municipalities, but that's their
Seems
opportunity
as if it
to
would be.
add, because the economics are different and everything is different, and there's money granted by the state or by the developer, well, through the state by the developer to do different studies, and the community has to get involved, and there's community advocates, and it's a much more involved process. So through that huge process, essentially, I think the IDA's position was,
This is what we do, this is the extent of what we do,
This is-
and the rest is up to you.
yeah, so the municipalities negotiate just like with Del Lago, the IDA negotiated the basic, the basic pilot, but then the town of Tyre has a community host agreement for additional benefits, and there's additional benefits to the county and all that was not part of the IDA pilot.
Okay, so this is what the policy has been.
Mhm.
Correct.
Supervisor Partee, do you wish to say anything? If you don't have to, you're invited to share your thoughts thus far. If not, you're okay.
Now, the only question I would ask at this point, based on what's been said so far, is you mentioned the IDA is neutral, and you will go with what the municipality approves. But what if the municipality has no say?
You mean in the case of a utility scale project?
Yes.
That's a good question. So, even though there is no formal approval required by the town in the case of a utility scale project, even though, a town couldn't hypothetically stop something like that, I think this board would very strongly consider, we still have, regardless for all of our projects, public hearing requirements, which are a great time to sort of take the temperature of the community and any municipal entities. We have to send notices for all of our projects directly to the municipality, so there are opportunities for your voice to be heard on a project, even if you don't have sort of the planning authority, and I think that this board would certainly take that into consideration.
So are you meaning this is like eminent domain?
No, so community scale projects are sort of done at the local planning level. They go through the planning board and get their approvals per, town zoning and everything. New York State, again, because they want to so heavily incentivize renewable energy, has taken it upon themselves to deal with the permitting and the environmental review and the siting process for utility scale projects, which is technically anything above 5 megawatts, but more commonly it's 20 and up. You don't see many developers that are doing projects smaller than that. And essentially they override any local control. They're supposed to have, as part of the process, local participants, and they're supposed to have groups that are involved in that sort of thing, but hypothetically you could have a project that's utility scale that gets through state approvals and is favorable but isn't really supported by the town government or by the people in the community, and then that would be a case where, again, even though it's not specifically, they may have had their planning approvals, that doesn't necessarily mean that the project would move forward past this board anyway. Not that the IDA would have the power to stop it, but they could, opt not to do a pilot agreement because the community is so strongly opposed.
But that doesn't, again, this is maybe a dumb question, but the municipalities opted out of 47. The IDA has concluded that this project does not need any incentives from the IDA. At that point, the town is really is in a position to determine just what kind of assessment or, what mechanism does the town have other than a host agreement in lieu of collecting property tax?
I think, it's down to the way I read the whole law thing is, at the end of the day, the municipality can do a full assessment
It's assessor.
But it can't be assessed more than what the real assessed value is. I mean, essentially, you can do a pilot. Say,
I mean, the town can construct its own pilot.
yes, but the pilot cannot be greater than what the tax would have been if it was fully assessed, probably through this New York State formula. So you can't, if the New York State formula said it's worth, you know, say $20 million, I don't know, just making, you know, the town can't say, well, New York State says it's worth 20 million, we're gonna say it's 30 million and have a higher pilot.
So the town right now, whether it's Phil Griswold or Jim Clear or Ann Morgan, who are the assessors, could actually function as they would with any other project in their jurisdiction, as long as it doesn't exceed that state threshold.
So in one way, I mean, we're talking about two different topics. One is, what should the tax rate be, or the payments, the tax payments to the municipality? I mean, that's one discussion, and that's essentially, is that really the only discussion the IDA has? The other one that, of course, Beth is concerned about is, well, that's fine and dandy, but if the town doesn't want that utility project, is there anything that can be done? And I doubt from an IDA perspective, because obviously if the IDA said, we don't want to, I guess the only thing we can do is say, we're not doing a pilot, and they have to pay the full assessment based on the New York State, which is what the assessors would probably have to use.
The only way that's powerful though, and I'll just say this because I know you've had concerns before, is every municipality that would be part of that project. So I know the town has opted out and the county has opted out, but I'm not sure about the school districts. I'd have to
Some
double
have.
check.
Some have,
And
What's that?
some have, not all.
so, you
Why
know,
can't you
that's
come
a
up with
key to
choice?
it, is if the incentives really matter that much to the developers,
Bring her up.
and you don't want the project, then every municipality really needs to opt out of 487. And then the IDA, you know, does not have to do a pilot. The developer could come and try to seek a pilot regardless of the 487 status. But if, you know, if it's obvious that there's not community approval for that project, the IDA would, I would think, deny that application. You know, and then you wouldn't have 487 or a pilot. That still doesn't necessarily guarantee that you've stopped the project, but at the very least, if they decide they want to try to move forward, they're going to be fully taxable. Because the problem with 487 is it's a little bit, maybe I shouldn't say this on camera, but I think it's a little bit predatory, quite frankly, in terms of the way that it treats municipalities. So it's, you know, it requires them to opt out, which is not that simple of a process. It has to be passed by local law and filed with multiple state agencies, and if you don't file it correctly, it doesn't matter if you passed a local law or not. And if you haven't opted out, you know, you're still fine, but you better be checking your mail and making sure that you're responding within your 60-day window, because if you don't, if you're 61 days late, too bad. And the state has gotten very clear about that guidance. And
I agree, I happen to agree with you. The other consideration is, has the economic environment changed since 2014, where apparently it seemed as if these energy companies needed more incentives? Has the environment changed to the point where they don't need more incentives? And how do we determine that? By simply not agreeing to extend the pilot? I mean, this was always the charter of the IDA being that we extend incentives when a project would not go forward without them. Kind of a broad sort of charter. Do we know if these projects would go forward without our incentives?
Well, I kinda asked one of the guys when they were here making a proposal, I said, dude, aren't these new interest rates gonna dramatically affect your project? And he said no at that time. It must be they had some sort of a locked-in source of funds, because between the essential, the cost of materials going up, we all know the inflation has been strong, and the interest rates being high, it seemed to me it would be very difficult for them to make a financial model, and that's all these are, is financial models, to lock in. That's why they like a pilot agreement, is because they can then with a contract, they know what their expenses are gonna be from a taxing standpoint.
Well, they would know what their expenses would be without a pilot also. If
Well, the
they were-
assessment would change.
If they were given what just the by-the-book assessment would be.
Except the state has it written into the law that that model is supposed to be updated every year, and so it's not an assessment. It could change, and the model is meant to change, so that every year you're supposed to
So,
rerun the model.
Yeah.
so it's
Which is
nice.
also something that's a little different than other properties.
So it's nice to know what your expenses are gonna be, but you've been in business, I've been in business, we don't know what our expenses are going to be. So that's just part of the risk of running any business.
Well, the difference is, you can grow your business when you do a project like this. Its output is fixed because it's just, you know, the
Yeah, but
physics
what's
of
not
converting
fixed,
sunlight.
what's not fixed is what the local utility company pays you for that power.
Oh, I'm sure that is fixed. They'll take a 30, you can't finance unless you have a contract that fixes that rate.
Yeah, they do
Okay.
contracts,
Yeah.
which is, okay, so, I included a list of the projects that we've approved to date, and this is just, you know, we won't get into too many of the details, but the Trilina project was approved by the IDA board back in 2021. That project, we still haven't closed on it yet, technically, with our legal documents, and a big part of that is because the siting process, especially for the utility scale, is so drawn out. The state's trying to condense it down a little bit, but the process that they had to go through is so drawn out that when they first bid to NYSERDA and got their contract rates, that was pre-COVID. And then, you know, supply chain went crazy, you know, things weren't shipping overseas, inflation is going up, interest rates are going up. And they've since had to rebid to NYSERDA for a new contract because the project wasn't feasible with the old rates. So there is some of that coming into play. I'm not saying that that is necessarily as applicable for the smaller projects, but there is some, you know, some level of uncertainty in the market, and it does seem like these developers, if they're not able to get incentives, that they wouldn't do these projects.
I think it's unclear. I think it's really unclear if they would or would not. I mean, all you can do is test it in the market.
That's true.
I mean, we're running into the same issue. I mean, I've got on the board, it's my 13th year or whatever, and can really, I think, easily say probably a good half of the pilots that we do, you know, the developer says they will not do this project without, but they rarely would.
Sure.
You know, and it's, you know, unfortunately, it's the way, I don't wanna say the way the rules are, and maybe it's not the best to do these things, but I think with solar, you know, we look at it, you know, what are the other counties around us doing, what's the NYSERDA guidance, that type of thing, and instead of trying to, again, well, maybe this guy could pay a little bit more, or maybe this, having a set rate, X amount per megawatt, I think is, you know, a nice, I don't wanna say an easier, but an easier, fair to do.
And what should that
And-
amount be? Part of, I think part of.
And I think that's the
What
the question, it's,
Is it
I mean,
4,500 or 8,000?
all we have is, NYSERDA, which is essentially saying, based on sort of the average sort of developer and how much they have to pay to put it in and how much revenue they get, what percentage of revenue is fair and proper. And of course, New York and NYSERDA have their bias towards, let's get more solar out there, obviously. But what is that number? Is it 45, is it more? And then you'd get into where there's say one developer who is very efficient, very skilled, and they can put in a solar and they could maybe pay more of a full assessment. And then there's another company that's maybe a little smaller, they're struggling a little bit more, and they need more of it. And so then we'd be almost saying, well, hey, small guy, we'll subsidize you and not, and I don't know, I really don't wanna get into this. I'd rather, just like the, state is looking supposedly annually, what's the proper assessment technique to get the proper full value for, full assessment. There probably should be maybe, and there could be another look on our part too, every year, what is the proper UTEP value? Obviously, if someone applies and it's 4,500, you can't go back and say, well, you applied at 4,500, we're raising it to 7,000 and too bad, but I think, that could be a reasonable thought is, do we look at this periodically and what's the proper?
I think so. It would certainly be worth the exercise on a annual or biannual basis.
The one thing I asked Sarah, and I think you guys should kind of taking a look too, is if you take a typical 5-megawatt project, like the one we just did, let's say in Lodi, we just approved, what would be the full taxable assessment based on the New York model? And what did we give them? So are we,
Okay.
so like doing a normal project, we may say, oh, we'll give you a 50% break. But 4,500 is what? Is that a 10% break? Is it a 90% break? Is it a what?
Good question. So this is where it gets a little bit complicated because, okay, for IDAs, we are required to state what the value of the exemption is being provided to a project. So we do have to calculate what we estimate the assessed value would be, full assessed value, and then the difference between what they're paying in a pilot. I only run the calculation one time for these solar projects. Technically, they're supposed to be run through the model every single year. Because it is a discounted cash flow model, that means that their property value is going down every single year. Because essentially what the state is doing is depreciating the solar panels. Okay, so based on year one, this is for the most recent Lodi solar project that we did, just one of them, because we did two separately. One of them, at the beginning of the project when this was run, would have been valued at 1.25 million. Okay?
According to the state model.
According to the state model. Their total pilot payment in year one, this is their base tax plus the 4,500 per megawatt, makes their total pilot payment 25,144. what they would have paid if they were fully taxed based on this value, the 1.25, would have been 46,318. So roughly in the first year, they were a little less than 50% exempt. And then, and this is where it gets tricky, is our model currently has a 2% annual escalator. So they're gonna pay more every year, which means their exemption is going down. But if we were really to calculate this out properly, I would need to rerun the model for every year thereafter. We could just assume for the purposes of calculation that the assessed value is gonna stay the same. But we have had more recently some developers come and say, well, if we're just fully taxed, you know, by the time this project hits that, 14 or 15 year mark, we'd be paying less in full taxes than what would be under this.
Yeah, am I correct with the depreciation? The value is going down.
Yes.
But
So-
that's.
So there's a point hypothetically where they would meet or come
Right,
close.
because it's bookkeeping versus reality.
But that's an issue that any assessor's assessment takes into account. And, I mean, you build a building and it depreciates too. How do the assessors currently incorporate that?
Although,
They don't.
well, because let's say you buy a building, I mean, theoretically, for tax purposes, it's probably like a 40-year depreciation or whatever.
Right?
But for tax purposes, it depreciates, but in reality, the building probably has the same or greater value as the years go by. It still has worth. So even though you say you buy a property, a building, 15 years from now, your taxes are probably your assessed value is probably gonna go up.
Correct.
But with a solar, you're not being assessed on property, you're being assessed, it's almost like being assessed on your car or something like that, that you're being assessed not on property, real estate property or building, you're being assessed on equipment that definitely becomes less valuable
It's,
over time.
Agreed.
So is it if someone, and again, these guys have lawyers, so I was like,
Sure.
I don't wanna say anything about lawyers, but anyways, come 15 years from now, as their value goes down, why would they not want to go with a full assessment, and why would they not wanna challenge that assessment every year?
And agreed, I see that, and that's just where I think at the heart of this, you need the skill set of an assessor. Because that's their field, that's their specialty and art. I certainly don't feel qualified to render a judgment on that very issue
Yeah.
right there, Steve, I think it's a fair one.
Yeah, and also though, the unique thing about the solar is, it's the ability to generate income. And that diminishes, the capacity of the panels diminishes over time, and they,
Not if the rate goes up, though, you generate.
but they're dealing with a fixed
I don't
contract.
think- Well,
Yeah, they're
for how many years? I mean, I don't know, do we know that?
25, when I asked the guy before, he said he had a 25-year contract. And that's their financial surety. Because technology could all of a sudden change something and the rate, the cost of electricity could go down. It's possible.
I'm sure you're right, but I
But-
can't say that every one of these projects, I mean, is NYSEG paying sources of energy today the rate that was established in 1999? I can't believe that, I just don't believe it. If they are,
Actually,
so be it.
So I had to negotiate one of these contracts once, so I do know, I have experience in it. And from the developer standpoint, you want the surety, you need that confidence that
Some,
your
yeah.
income stream is coming in. Utilities are different, and the rates are legislated. It's not like cost of production manufacturing, it's very different, the regulated
I
environment
believe
you're
that.
in.
I believe that.
So, and solar too is another thing, is that the panels themselves just don't generate as much electricity as they get older, and then you have to replace them all. But because nobody's had them in service this long and the technology is changing, that's a moving target too, because now they're saying, well, these panels will probably last 30 years, and they used to use a 20-year model. But that was, again, more for constructing a financial model for, just figuring out how to build it and that kind of thing.
And run it.
Anything beyond that's gonna be just a benefit. But, so I don't know that an assessor would actually have the skill set for this, because it's a whole new area.
So where do we, again, MRB did a study, where do we look for the most reliable guidance in this
The state.
area?
They're supposed to have the
I
expertise.
don't agree. I think the state has an agenda. I'm not saying I agree with it or I don't agree with it.
Right, oh, I think so too.
But I would almost look at someone that's neither, I mean, they're an independent arbiter on these questions of assessment, of depreciable lifetime value of a solar panel manufactured in 2024.
Mhm.
I have no idea. I mean, but there must be, it would be helpful, and I think Beth's suggestion was that maybe the IDA could benefit from that. I don't know if we could or not, but it might be something we should consider.
So we should look to find outside advice. I wonder would MRB have?
I think they might be a candidate, but I think there might be others too. I kind of feel like that would be helpful. I don't know, Steve, what do you think?
Yeah, I think, at the end of the day, unfortunately, solar gets somewhat politically charged, unfortunately. It doesn't provide very many jobs. Some people like it, some people don't. Some property owners, why can't I go and have someone come in, it's my property? And we've had that issue too. It's messy. At the end of the day, I just kind of go back to what's our true role in this? Again, no balls, no strikes, no yes, no no's. If a town wants to come in and do full assessment or whatever, that's fine. We're not gonna sneak around and negotiate a pilot differently. If we've had towns that have come to us and say, we'd like you to negotiate on our behalf, sure, we'll do that. We've done that before and we'll continue to do that. The New York has come up with this assessment protocol, which is, I guess, what the assessors need to use for a town for full assessment. So that seems, out of our hands and out of everyone's hand too. The only thing left is what is the proper X dollars per megawatt. We've got, especially in the MRB report, we've got, I don't know how many counties that are doing this. Instead of, I don't know if Seneca County wants to be the leader and what should we do, we're essentially, hey everyone, what's everyone doing? We may decide, well, we don't want to be on the low side of this, maybe we should be on the higher side, but I don't know if I'd want to spend a lot of time or effort to, I don't know, second guess someone versus I don't want to be necessarily the IDA being taken advantage of. If people are doing, higher rates per megawatt, maybe we should look at that too. But I don't think we should be an outlier, one way or the other.
Mhm.
Just, again, consistent, so when someone comes in, it's a known entity.
So let me, again, I think just to sort of play back what I heard you say, it's in the IDA's best interest to be clear, consistent, and even-handed across the board, not be on too far on either end of the bell curve. And if towns don't like that, well, fine, they can go and use the state assessment and hope to get that agreement signed.
Yeah.
It seems to me, again, for consistency, I understand what you're saying, Bruce, about the state. They have said clearly they have their program, they want to encourage solar. But for us, the easy path is just to follow the state guidelines, relying on their expertise and leadership in this area, with the state plan of going to renewable energy.
I don't wanna take the state's guidelines at face value, is all I would say. It may be the right way to go, I'm not sure that I want to. I personally feel like that's an option, but it's not the only option. And, are there other comments?
What would happen if we didn't even use a pilot on this?
Well, that's certainly on the table here.
So that's a good question. Maybe we should look through this flow chart just to kind of talk about
If
that.
we opt out of giving it to these people, to all of, any of these, town can do what they want to a host agreement. They're not creating any jobs, and that's our purpose, and one thing, to give pilots, right? You wanna keep building up and creating jobs. We might be better off to leave this alone and not have to go through all this struggle
So,
and put our emphasis in creating jobs.
so if we want to pursue that as an option, what I will say is the most feasible path, if the IDA board feels they do not want to be in the business of solar pilots anymore, is to essentially start an advocacy effort with all the municipalities in Seneca County and get them to all opt out of 487. And I think it'll become clear if we go through sort of this flow chart. So this was something that resulted from a conversation that Steve and I had, that sort of is, what is really the process for a developer to potentially get incentives? So, under the most recent amendments to 487, the developer needs to send this notice to the municipalities, letting them know about their intent to construct, and they need to give them a 60-day period to respond. Okay, so that happens. The municipality, if the municipality has previously opted out, so following the yes over to the left, there are two ways that this could go. One is solar project is fully taxable. That's, sort of assuming that the municipality's opted out and the IDA is not doing a pilot, or the other option is that, the developer could come to us for a pilot agreement. The 487, doesn't negate the IDA's ability to do a pilot.
Doesn't lock them out of that option.
Correct. If a municipality's opted out, the IDA has, we are a public authority. We have the right to do pilot agreements.
Or not.
Or not. Okay. So that's, the simplest is they opt out, and then let's say that the IDA decides we don't want to do pilots anymore, then we have sort of that first option on the left, the solar project's fully taxable. That's the simplest. If the municipality has not opted out of 487, then it bridges again. So, did they respond within 60 days requesting a pilot? If not, solar developer gets the 487 exemption, which is 100% exempt on the added value of the project for 15 years. And they are not obligated to make any pilot payments. Meaning that even if the solar developer, for whatever reason, this has happened in other counties, and I don't know specifically where, but I could find out if anybody was that interested. Essentially, if a solar developer has said, come to the IDA and decided they wanted to negotiate a pilot, anyway, the pilot does not circumvent if they were not if the municipality did not write back and did not require one, the developer could decide they're not gonna pay their pilot payments, and the law would support them. Because the municipality did not require it in writing in time.
A municipality.
And that's bad actor, I mean, that's bad actors, I'm not saying that everybody is gonna do that, but that's sort of worst case,
Yeah.
what could happen. Okay, so if the municipality did respond in writing requiring a pilot, then there's again two options. The municipality is empowered under 487 to negotiate its own pilot agreement, or the municipality can ask the IDA to negotiate a pilot agreement on its behalf. One of the projects that's in our pipeline right now, New Leaf Energy is looking to do I'm not sure the size, I think probably 5 megawatt solar project in the town of Romulus. Romulus, the school district got the notice and had reached out to me for guidance, and they had not opted out. They did respond in time and require a pilot agreement, but they have asked that the IDA handle it. We don't have an application or anything at this point in time, but, you know, we are anticipating they wrote back to the developer and let them know of their intentions. So that's sort of the different options and the way this branches, but essentially it comes down to, if this board is really not interested anymore in doing this, the best case for the county as a whole is to have everybody opt out of 487, so that projects would essentially just have to be fully taxable. If the IDA decided not to do pilots anymore for solar, but we still had some school districts or towns that had not opted out, you know, they could still require pilots, and a lot of them are not equipped to negotiate or do their own pilot agreements. They're not used to it. So then the board could get sort of dragged back into it just by that. And so if, as a group, everybody feels strongly enough, that's where my recommendation would be to make sure that we educate, you know, all the different jurisdictions on how to go through that process.
So municipalities can opt out of 487 without any notice from a developer. It's simply a matter of saying, we don't have anything pending right now. We simply understand the issue that we have not, and now it's time to opt out.
Yeah.
Seems like a no-brainer.
Again, you know, I don't wanna take away a tool in our toolbox if, like you said, Romulus, if someone wants our help, definitely, do that.
Sure, sure.
If the municipality does not want us involved, then,
So be it.
okay, so be it. Then, you know, I don't wanna force ourselves onto anyone who,
But isn't it, they don't have the expertise, they would get some fees for it, but they would have to be redundant to the activities that we have in this office to write their own.
so it'd be a lot simpler for them just to come to the IDA and do this. I mean, that's,
And that's the whole point of having the IDA.
yeah. And you look at it, and I don't wanna make light of the amount of money, because I mean, every dollar counts, but, you know, a developer, you know, well, someone comes in, developer wants to come in, especially with a smaller project, a 5 megawatt, 3 megawatt. It's, you know, true, there's not that many jobs, but it is additional income for the taxing jurisdictions that they wouldn't have got it. So if they say, well, we're not getting any jobs, let's not approve the solar and give up 25,000 a year because we don't want it. I don't know, you know, that's their prerogative. For the amount of money a town gets, how much do they wanna bother negotiating a pilot versus having an IDA do it, because that's a big pain too. So in many ways, we're, you know, looking at, you know, small amounts, well, especially for community solar, small amounts of money. It gets, to me, it's overly politicized, and that's where it gets a little tricky. So from an IDA perspective, to me, like what Sarah says, if, you know, municipalities want to opt out, they wanna handle this, they wanna do it fully taxable, fine. If a municipality doesn't wanna opt out, or they want us to do a negotiation for them, fine,
I
we'll
think
do that.
that all makes sense, Steve, and I think one thing that towns don't fully appreciate is the difference in tax revenue from agriculturally assessed property to even a pilot agreement for the same amount of property. Just in the case of Lodi, it's significant. It's not insignificant for some of the very, very small communities. And I don't think the IDA has done a good enough job yet of making that really obvious and clear. Here's what you get today. On Sarah's spreadsheet, it's there, but it's a little bit like an eye chart. It's hard to find. Here's what you're getting today. Here's what you're gonna get next year, and over the course of 15 years, that amount is X, and then that's after the incentives expire. And then another 15 years, when there are no incentives, you're gonna get Y. It's a big number for a lot of towns.
So let's talk about that a little bit, just because it is very common to say, and it is valid, that these types of projects do not create long-term permanent jobs. And that, you know, so they don't have sort of what the traditional IDA goal is in terms of economic benefit. There are a few things, though, that they do, I think, contribute that is worth noting. One, and I'll start with probably the most selfish one, is that they are a good source of agency fees for us. So we collect on all of our projects a 1% fee on the total capital cost. That allows us to continue to operate as an organization. It pays our staff salaries, but also it allows us to make investments in other economic development projects. The investment that the board chose to make to support the Willard Highest and Best Use study is because of revenue that we've been able to realize from some of these projects. So there is value in that. The other piece on the taxing jurisdiction side of it is that oftentimes when you're thinking of new economic development projects, yes, you want them to bring in more people and you want more jobs, and that's all wonderful. But there can be downsides to that in the sense of that puts more strain on municipal services, a lot of times on water, on transportation, on schools, on, you know, because you have new people coming. And not to say that any of that is bad, in the end it ends up being quite good. One of the things to think about with solar is that you are getting additional tax revenue, but with very minimal additional cost on the municipal side. There's not really extra strain that's on your roads. You don't have daily truck traffic as a result of this. You don't have, you know, new people flooding into schools and all of a sudden have to figure out how do you accommodate, you know, with teaching staff and that sort of thing. So just to use the Lodi project as an example, their total taxes, this is both Lodi projects, I should say, combined, their total taxes pre-project, sort of without a pilot agreement, those municipalities are receiving just under $80,000, or would receive under $80,000 over a 15-year period, okay? So this is
based on the assessment of the agricultural land,
Yes.
currently.
yes.
So 15 years, $80,000.
They would receive $80,000. As a result of these projects, they are gonna have an additional, okay, so this is new addition, not total, an additional $778,000 over that same period of time.
So that's almost 10X. So what do they do with that money? Does that money translate into jobs? Does it buy a new snowplow? Does it hire another crossing guard? Whatever. Again, that's all part of getting the public to understand what the overall benefit may be, which is 80,000 over 15 years compared to 800.
And that's not including, these projects did not have a community benefit agreement, but that, you know, obviously doesn't include that. Those agreements are negotiated directly with the towns usually.
For small towns, That's
So-
meaningful, I don't know, it's meaningful money. And for the IDA, I mean, we talk about how one of the ways Syracuse, their LD, Economic Development Corporation, was able ultimately to attract Micron, big number, 100 billion theoretically. Well, they accumulated enough capital to purchase real estate in places that ultimately ended up being where this site was approved. Now, you know, it's like Deer Run Industrial Park, it's sort of the industrial park model. If the IDA in Seneca County wants to pursue that industrial park model, then it needs capital to do so. This is one of the ways to do it. I'm not saying we do wanna pursue the industrial park model, but if you look at everything that's going on between 318 and the Thruway, I think it's, and given what our current industrial and economic base is, having another $8 to $10 million might be really constructive.
Tip the scale, tipping point.
But you're not growing the county in population or anything either with all of these. If you get industry in and people come in, you're multiplying.
It's a
You've been
big,
sitting at 33,000 for what, 20 years?
I know,
So
but,
you're not growing it, this isn't gonna help Seneca County growing anyway.
well, it may not be by itself the one way to do it, but it might be one of the tools. I'm not arguing that it is, but it has a potential for doing that. Anyway, I don't wanna take more than an hour, we're already past an hour. What would we say is our next steps from this meeting? Can anybody summarize them? I think we need to look at kind of the state of other counties that are either contiguous or comparable, and just get a better sense of what the current policy is. And I think that's one, MRB did that back in 22.
Yeah.
Beth supplied some other data from some other counties. I think just to take a reading of what the consensus practice is good.
What, it seems to me that the piece that we're missing is the industry piece, like, excuse me, what in today's environment do they think that they could afford? It's a negotiation. I mean, we're coming up with ideas saying, you know, trying to, you know, like, say, well, we think you can afford this, but it's like we haven't heard from the other side saying,
Okay,
this is way out of line.
okay, I think that is also a fair thing to try to understand is what, I mean.
Because
it's a factor,
things
it's
are
a factor,
changing so
though. It's a
fast.
factor.
I mean, we can look at what other counties have done in the past, we can look at what New York State, these are guidelines. But the things are changing fast, and really, other than MRB, I don't know who to talk to other than solar developers themselves and say.
There are solar developer trade associations.
Yes.
They're gonna represent the interests of their members, but I think that's a source that we can probably draw upon
Okay.
also. And I have some contacts in that world. What about revisiting the 4,500 number?
Well, I thought that's what we were talking about.
Okay, if that's what we're talking about, okay, all right.
So, yeah, as you said, I think, yeah, making sure municipalities understand the process better.
Of opting out, or.
Of opting out, or if, what are their options, sort of pros and cons. I think
Okay.
make sure they understand their option, that, again, what are the communities around us doing for, dollars for megawatts?
Well, and I think the reason I like being part of this group is that we can provide some leadership in that regard, so that, I mean, you know, just because something's happened in the past, when conditions change, we can be the ones saying, this is where it's going in the future. This is where you'll be successful. Every negotiation is contentious, but some are gonna be more successful than others. Where are the highs and the lows, you know?
Yeah.
Okay, anything else, anybody? Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second,
Second.
all in favor,
Aye.
I
all opposed, we're adjourned, thank you.